is. Sensitive and intelligent people like ourselves are trying to discover what is viable within our capacities to experience and to express, and what threads can be taken up and woven together to make a continuing life for ourselves and for our kind. And here at this particular center, this is about 6 years now that we've been here, trying to look at the old classical Hellenistic world, the way in which the Hellenistic world came together in a very powerful symbolic implosion somewhere around the time of the life of Jesus. And that many of the viable traditions of the ancient world, Egyptian, archaic Greek, ancient India, the ancient Semitic traditions, all came together and were fused into a symbolic unity. The unity has not held in its civilized expression, but the unity has been unimpaired in the deep psyche all this time, and we still have within ourselves the capacity to touch that single center and revivify for ourselves an interior experience which can be expressed in language. And so the work here has been to make an educational program, a 2-year cycle that we work on Saturday mornings, and a center of experience from the deep psyche, which we are trying to tap on Tuesday and Thursday nights. Thursday nights at the Philosophic Research Society with Manly Hall's facilities and backing, and Tuesday night here with our trying to go into Mahayana Buddhism, trying to understand how Taoism became a religion out of the Chinese tradition, trying to understand how Christianity and Judaism began. And in that work in the last 3 years, more and more, the material has taken a shape. And the shape is becoming a book which is being written now, and I have somewhat over 400 cassettes and about 300 and some pages written. And the book will be entitled Jesus in Alexandria. And the appendix to that book is a liturgy which has been pieced together, a Hermetic wisdom liturgy. And we can't really call it a Christian liturgy because this would have been practiced before there was anything like Christianity. This would have been practiced before any kind of happenings in Jerusalem. This would have been practiced around, I use the date symbolically, 0 BC. And as close as I can, I have put together from excerpts, from insights over the last 3 years, this Hermetic wisdom liturgy, and tried to focus it in Alexandria about 0 BC. What would the practice have been for those spiritual communities, not always ascetic, but very frequently so, whose origin was most likely in the Synedria of the Pythagorean communities from the late 6th century, early 5th century BC. The Synedria of the meeting houses of the Pythagoreans later on became the places of gathering for several major world religions, early Christianity, one of them. So this Hermetic Wisdom Liturgy will be an appendix to the volume, Jesus in Alexandria. And we're trying here every 7 weeks to follow the ancient Jewish tradition of having a record of the deepest cycle of response that we're capable of. And the deepest cycle of response apparently is every 50 days. So that this Jubilee, this 7 times 7, and then the next one, this 50-day cycle seems to be not only characteristic of the ancient festival cycle, planting and harvesting and first fruits and thanksgivings and praisings and so forth. That ancient festal cycle was every 50 days. But for us, we're trying to establish here a sensitivity, not so much as a religious performance, but as a show and tell on the deepest level. So we're going to present as best we can this liturgy, and we're going to use some of the elements that were characteristic of it, and you may recognize some of them, you may not. But none of them come from any identifiable religious tradition that is now operating. This would have been characteristic of something 2,000 years ago in a city which at that time was very much what LA is today, the meeting place of all the world. As you know, Alexandria was made to be the megaphone of Alexander the Great's ecumenikos, one world. And the structure of the one world was a one mankind. And for that single mankind, there was to be a meeting of the psychic energies of all the peoples of the world. And Alexandria was the place for that. It was the anvil and the megaphone where that was to happen. And some 350 years after it was founded for that purpose, it apparently did happen. But because of the vicissitudes of geology and history, we have absolutely nothing left. Classical Alexandria has subsided, and most of what would have been of interest to us is now under 60 feet of water and mud in the harbor of Alexandria. There have been some expeditions. My friend Stephen Schwartz took an expedition to Alexandria some years ago and found enough to merit going back. But what we're after here is to perform a ceremony as best we can, which is evocative. And if we do it right, we should be able to have something to talk about after the ceremony is over and after we have some refreshments, to just talk among ourselves for a half hour or so. What have we seen? What have we experienced? How do I feel about this? What do I hear in others' comments? And so this is an open forum. And rather than a church or as some esoteric above ground catacomb, it's merely a schoolroom for the spirit, a place where we can observe with as much dedication as we can bring to bear on a focus like this Hermetic Wisdom Liturgy. Now, I wish Sydney had been here, but I will have to perform the elder's role. And so I'm going to step in front of the desk and move these microphones there and conduct the liturgy as best I can. I'll narrate the happenings so that you can follow. Most of you have had a copy of this at some time or another over the last 2 months. As far as I can tell, the liturgy began with a bell rung with the resonance allowed to just occur and fade out. So we'll begin in that way. Then came the invocation. And the words were, Holy Spirit of wisdom, flow through our persons with your person freely. Express within our images your deep remembrance. Truth, coherent light, the unseen unveiled, the seen perfected. Come, Holy Spirit, be here at home. From the full to the full, all is full. Then after the invocation was the establishment of the community on the spot in terms of the voices. In terms of the voices assenting to the establishment of the community, which had to be done apparently every time that the population came together. It was by their assent only that the community was established and that the liturgy could continue. And so the establishment of the community was in this way. Will the men, able to be fully present, signify aloud by saying yea in assent of their willingness? Yea. Will the women, able to be fully present, signify by saying aloud yea in assent? Yea. Hereby, as the community assembled, will all confirm this a third time by saying aloud yea. Yea. Then the bell was rung 3 times to signify now that from the invocation, the community now had taken the dynamic from the invocation and established the community. From 1 bell ring now to 3. Now I believe at this time that incense was lit because of the heat of the evening, if you will all consent to imagining incense. The incense was of 2 kinds in Alexandria at this time. One was kaife, which had 16 different ingredients, and the other was just a single incense made out of frankincense. So it was either kaife or frankincense, and I'm not sure which one. I would think that frankincense. The next section follows on the establishment of the community. And the community, once established, was put into motion so that the liturgy now is developing from an invocation to the establishment of the community and putting that community into motion. And the term that was used at the time was sojourning. And I suppose the connotation that we would recognize here is like a stranger in a strange land. That we are in an alien environment and our true home is elsewhere, and we are moving towards that true home. We are on a journey. That our life here is a journey moving towards that. And so we are sojourning, but together. One person alone is at rest, does not move, is unmoving, finds the fount within in an unmoving way, but the community finding it discovers that they travel together, soaking. And then these words go with it. The self-existent in Holy Spirit rests within this assembled community. Together sojourning in this world, placed in this star system, now the very focus of right speech. May Kyrios freely speak through our offered sight and condition. May the Lord in open speech bless this sacrificial way. May the true nature nourish these shapes of doing and saying. Lord, be with us. Joy on the one, Lord, primordial from the Lord. And closing out this whole section was a single bell rung. So that in this sequence, in the liturgy, from an invocation to the establishment of the community to putting the community into motion, the next phase began with a statement of vision, and that the vision was an opening out from within. And these words were meant to carry this. We desire to see beyond this imaged world, our sight perfected to discover the existence soaring above the star of our senses, staying with this company, enfolded by the Holy Spirit to carry us to wholeness indeed. And then, as the vision would be shared by these words, an undercurrent was added, which the traditional word for it in Latin, passion. And in this, the bell was rung insistently, rapidly, with this kind of language. Lord, most high wisdom, here we are, rapt and ready, yearning, still yearning. With the vision and with the passionate undercurrent added to it, then came the first manipulation of ritual, ceremonial objects. And the first object was a consecration of oil. And the traditional phrase for this was the oil of gladness. Now, this use of oil became truncated later on in Christian church practice and modified in Islamic and Jewish practice, but in the ancient Alexandrian technique, I believe it followed this kind of concourse. A statement of the oil of gladness. Through the Holy Spirit, we are indeed begotten again. But we are begotten through the Lord and the two. We are anointed through the Spirit. When we were begotten, we were from the two, begotten again. We first accept the oil of gladness, preparing us for a mystery, a mysterious person that knowing discovers, prepare us to find. Then came the consecration of an oil dish. Now, I'm using a sterling silver dish that was found on a house that I owned up by the observatory one time. It has a tree of life engraved on it with the roots. And the roots are separated from the tree of life by a space, a gap, kind of a synapse gap. And it seemed an appropriate cup. The consecration of the oil dish was then with these words. What is within holds space. time in form in this world. What is hidden as their inner parts stands upright and lives. This dish is able to hold within it an oil. Then came the consecration of the oil. The traditional oil was an olive oil, and added to it was balsam. Now, the supply of balsam in Los Angeles is not readily available, so we're going to use rose water. The bringing of the two together is called chrism. I'll use just a little of this here, filling just the bottom of the cup, and adding a little bit of rose water. Then came the words, the consecration of the oil. The free fluidity of this balsam of oil and spirit is able to hold within it the sealing shape of the wisdom light. Then this was applied in an individual sequence that followed this. The elder would turn to the first person and make the consecration by holding the dish in the right palm and with the ring finger of the left hand dabbing a little oil first on the temples and just letting the finger rest a little bit on the temples with the words, "This inner horizon awake." And then again tapping in between the eyes and the forehead, "This aspirant awake." And then the consecrating vehicle was given to that person, and they passed this on to the next, following the same procedure. So we'll just do that with your permission to see how this feels. You might stand for it if you yeah, this aspect.
This inner horizon awake. This aspirant awake.
Inner horizon awake. Aspirant awake.
By now the community would have been brought to the focus, a quietness individually, but a shared, interpenetrative, sharing dynamic. Two different movements, the center and the spin. And these two together were preparing one then for the spiritual dimension. And I believe that the focus at this time was to bring out of the experience of the individuals sacred poems and hymns which they would have written themselves out of their own practice, out of their own contemplative practice, out of their own meditative experience. And we have a few people who have been doing this, so we have some individuals who are able to do this. This was a call for hymns sacred hymns, and the words run like this. This community has sealed itself. Are there hymns or sacred poems from individual experience to offer? Words from individual contemplation for shared experience in this self-sealed community. Now, the emphasis was here that there is no hierarchical structure. There's no authority being used, but the community has engendered its own integrity, and in the shared dynamic of that integrity, the quiet personal voice of the individual was welcome, was able to be heard in its own terms. And for the individual, this was a juncture, a meeting of their deepest private language with the attentiveness and receptiveness of the shared community. Just as the shared community's voice met the quiet privateness of the individual, this was the other movement out. The one movement is an integration, the other is a differentiation. The integration is towards the private silence, and the differentiation is the words from the individual coming out to the community at large. So both movements, and in the Hermetic tradition, always these two movements occurred together, and it was their paired complementarity that produced the sealing, the Hermetic seal, which could not be broken. And so we are calling for hymns or sacred poems, and those who have been following this on Tuesday nights, I expect will have some. So I call for some of you who have them to offer them up at this time.
Show us, O Lord, a higher way, freed of the yoke of trivial things, to serve you better. We bring our gifts to the altar, all that we are and know, to serve you better. Help us, O Lord, to hear thy voice, the silent pulse of life's love, and serve you better. Teach us, O Lord, to stand before thee with steadied eyes and open hearts, and serve you better. Lead us, O Lord, into ourselves, that we may know thee more and serve you better.
Are there other hymns or sacred poems from individual experience to offer?
Deep waters, relax, then shift, opening up pathways to Him, our everlasting love.
Are there other hymns or sacred poems from individual experience to offer?
My name is pleasure and ecstasy. I bring suffering and delight. I am the seductress and the virgin, mother of all possibility, father of all action, realization of all being. I am the fiery retort. I am the fuel and the spark. I am the fire, the heat, the smoke, the light. I am the dream of possibility, which makes life tolerable and worth living. I am the chaos which transforms. I am the center of the storm. I am the fury of the storm. I am that which seeks freedom. I am that which loves entrapment. I am the master of all, yet I do not know myself. I am the realization of time and pattern. I am eternal, outside of fixity and system. I am an irreducible mystery.
Are there other hymns or sacred poems from individual experience to offer?
Sought and seeker converge in this flesh. Partaking of his fullness, we become as he. Heart, throat, tongue, we spark with flames emitting therefrom, a voice within a word, mystery, grace. We are satisfied by a life eternal, from the true bread raised, our sins forgiven.
Are there other hymns or sacred poems from individual experience to offer? Paired hands plowing the psyche's deep waters upwards. Rises this dynamic flow, opening hands wide in praise. Now, as that cycle would have generally included everyone in the community, that is to say, everyone who would have been present would have had the practice and would have brought something to the community. And at this time, it was up to the elder, who was sometimes styled the president. Philo, in his writing, styles this figure sometimes as the president. The translation of the word would be president. Elder is probably better for our consideration. The elder at this time would choose one of those poems, one of those sacred hymns, and deliver an extempore, spontaneous sermon, which was a particular kind of a sermon. It was a sermon hermeneia. Hermeneia generally translates as interpretation now. Hermeneutics, we get the word hermeneutics from this. And the interpretation, the hermeneutic angle of this, was to try to bring out a cyclic indirectness into a direct expression. The move was from two different modes of language. The first mode of language is a mythic mode, which has a cyclic pattern. And the second mode is a logical mode, which has a vector, or it has a line of development, a train of argument, as sometimes it's called. And so the motion would have been one of converting the sacred language, using the sacred language of a poem or a hymn as the fulcrum, and beginning to take its meaning in the mythic sense and develop it into its logical directive, always exhibiting in the logical mode a purpose, whereas in the mythic mode there was not so much a purpose but a sense of completeness of pattern. The purpose would have been a perfecting mode of language, whereas the mythic would have been a sense of completeness. So you have two different movements again in language, two different kinds of sense of meaning: completeness, perfection. And that balancing between the two of them was the example. And if the example were from deep meditation, we talked about this, those of you who've been here on Tuesday nights, how one takes initial words, quotations, logoi as they were called, like the Gospel according to Thomas is a collection of these kinds of logoi. The Pythagorean sayings were a collection of these kinds of logoi. And the Dhammapada is a collection of these kinds of logoi. There's a classical form in antiquity, and those would have been the seeds for your meditation or your contemplation. And the technique was to engender images out of those words for yourself. And then in your imagination, using those images as your image base to engender a sense of feeling toned meaning. So that now the feeling toned meaning has come out of the images of someone else's words, some sage, the Buddha, Pythagoras, and Jesus. Their words made your image base that you're using now. And that image base has been amplified and refined into a feeling tone experience, which is within. Then the technique was to let that become quiet. Let that become silent. Let that settle into, the Gnostic word was rest. And then to pray, or contemplate, or meditate in silence, without images, without words, without feelings. And then coming out of the meditation, coming out of the contemplation, coming out of the prayer, again the feelings flow, again the words flow, again the images flow, but there was a distinct difference. Instead of having an imagination matrix, they now had a memorative, a mnemonic matrix. So that instead of working with the imagination, you were working with memory. And instead of the focus being, as it is in imagination, using a referent going back to nature, natural things, or the final reference in the imagination, but in the memory, the referent is always the deep self. Whenever memory, the art of memory, is working, when one remembers, the basis upon which memory works is the deep self, distinct from nature. Nature transformed into its deep self in you. So that now the words, whatever words came immediately, those were the words that were the fruitful words for your hymn or your poem, sacred poem, or your prayer. And that's what would have been brought here. That fruit of that individual experience and shared in this context. And the priest, the elder, would have chosen one of those to speak on. All of the individual contributions were offered up, and the elder would have chosen one of those to make his sermon hermenea on, and would have talked in this specific, technical, structured way of transforming the mythic into the logical, bringing the symbolic focus into balance in that way, not throwing the mythic away, not ignoring the logical, but bringing them into balance in terms of the symbolic self. Then the community, this sealed community, this community would have uttered a prayer together. And this would have been a typical community prayer, which all would have recited together. And I suppose that very few of you brought this, so I'll read this out. At the beginnings, light of the world, shine for all, those in need, those giving. Give for us the fine brightness of heavenly light, illumining our minds, ourselves, and our lives. May the quest for truth continue, and continuing, thrive in our nourishment. We thank openly for this radiance that we are and do. Then following the prayer would have been a community song, a community prayer and a community song, and it would have been something familiar. These were highly literate people. They would have had a broad acquaintance with all kinds of literature. Now in the Christian early church, what was used were the actual Psalms, the Old Testament Psalms, very, very frequently. An example of this, for instance, in the New Testament is the Epistle to the Hebrews, which is a sermon hermenea on the 104th Psalm. And it's an example of just how this kind of community would have been operating in the city of Alexandria about 53, 54 AD, written by Apollos of Alexandria. But the community psalm would have been sung together, men and women alternating lines, so that they would have sung this from memory together. The men would have sung the first line, then the women would have sung the second line, and the women the men the third line, and the women the fourth, until they got to the last line of the psalm, which they would sing together. And again, the technique was one of interweaving men and women, the voices of the men, the voices of the women, the community made in this way. And I was going to use what we had used several months ago, and just a trial run of this, we used Shelley's hymn stanza from the Hymn to Intellectual Beauty. But because of the heat of the day and everything, we'll just move on from this. Once the community prayer and the community psalm were sung, then it was time for a deepening. Now the oil of praise, of consecration, the oil of gladness, was a preparation. Following all of the development of the ritual from that point to this was a practicing of that preparation for something deeper, for a mystery. And the mystery was focused around an inner group called the rota. The rota. And you can play with the anagram and come up with tarot or whatever. The rota meant the round, but it meant the cycle of an inner group, a consistent group, not a more esoteric group. I imagine that the origin of it was like in the Pythagorean Synedria. There were acousmatiki and mathematiki. And the mathematiki were the inner group, were those who were able to see with their mind's eye, to see the structure. Not only to hear it from the master and recognize it, but to see it with their own mind's eye, the mathematiki. So the rota probably comes from that kind of a referent, that kind of a geometric inner sight capacity. But here we have, from the Tuesday night class, we have 3 people who are going to be the rota. And it reads something like this. Certain regulars of the community in this ceremony constitute the rota, the round of persons midway between the elder and the community as a gathered whole. This may be any small number of persons, to include both men and women, but always a regular group as much as can be, so that in the ongoing life of the community, those who had been around for a long time, who were consistently around, a selection of those constituted the rota. The rota then stand in a regular line before the community. They're offering service. So those who are going to be in this rota, if you would come up, there are 3 of you. And the elder on the left end, and our hands and eyes lifted up. Hands open in token of clean giving and acceptance. And we pray to God that our feasting may be acceptable and proceed as He would have it. Now, thank you, and we'll pass this out. Now, in classical times, there would have been an actual feast, a banquet, a dinner, a meal. It was only through later practice that this was reduced to what has become the standard communion. It would have been a meal. But in the practice, the ascetic practice of later times, it came to be bread and wine. Now the Rhoda are going to serve just some parts of this matzahs. We're not going to use wine tonight. We're going to use sparkling Martinelli apple juice, with your permission. And if you would start that around. You can pour, and I'll get some more cups. We're almost through. We're almost through. Notice the change in atmosphere. Notice that there's a kind of an upwelling going on, nourishment, sustenance. You can feel the change in the atmosphere. That was a natural part of it. A solemn kind of a communion is not it. It misses it. It's beginning to come out, yeah. We may have to open another. Would you open another one from the refrigerator? Yeah, just bring one out of the refrigerator, and there's a. And there would have been phrases of holding up the food and the drink and participating, substance of life, and the spirit in life. I wasn't served, so pretend I have some. Eat and drink together. Then, our old friend, the bell, would have been rung 3 times while eating and drinking. In other words, the deep concentration is blended back into life, the primordial life activity, taking nourishment, sustenance. That life is not other than, but is an amplification of this very activity that we have been concentrating on. That contemplation is the center of life and not an opposite from life. It's not a way to extinction, but a way to life. And then, at the end of the ceremony, there would have been a closing hymn. Whichever hymn or sacred poem or prayer that had formed the basis of the elder's sermon hermeneia, that would have been sung from memory by the community together. So that one would have had to be in a very attentive mode, very deep contemplative mode, to have remembered that hymn or that prayer, because you would never have heard it before. In fact, nobody would have heard it before. And part of the elder's sermon, the effectiveness, the technique of the effectiveness, was to have made that prayer, that sacred poem, that hymn, rather indelible in your mind, in your memory, in your hearing, so that you could have sung it from memory. If the community was unable to sing that, the elder would not have done his work right. His sermon would have not been effective. So then there was the closing hymn, whichever hymn or sacred poem or prayer the elder used for the service is the closing hymn. The entire community sings this together from memory, if possible, from copy page if necessary. And the community stands to sing. And we're not going to sing, but if you would all just stand together. And if we could all just hum together for 20 seconds. Then the elder goes around the community, laying on hands, saying, let us take this into our world. Let us make a gift of ourselves to life.